bienvenidos a todos. Boirun, as some people say in Ladino. My name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, La Hermandad Sephardic de America. We're so happy to have you all together here again. Already amazing. We have over 170 people joining, and we're going live on Facebook right now. It's such a pleasure to welcome you all. This program is done on behalf of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America through our new Sephardic Digital Academy initiative, a national partnership program with many communities around the country and Sephardic educators teaching Torah, Sephardic history, obviously, culture, traditions, Ladino language, even Sephardic foods, and a whole lot more. And I encourage you all to please check out all the amazing classes we have, in addition to Professor Naar's wonderful class here tonight at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. I want to take a moment first to thank our general supporting organization, the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation, for helping to support us this evening with this three-part program, as well as our partners at Congregation Orve Shalom and Seattle Sephardic Network for the incredible support with this amazing program, and generally with all the amazing programming we're doing through the Sephardic Brotherhood. This is a part of an initiative in general. We're trying to engage our wider community, both within the Sephardic, our local Sephardic community, and nationally and internationally, and bring the Sephardic voice kind of back to the forefront of what it means to be Jewish in America, what it means to be an American. And certainly this talk about Sephardic Jews and race in the United States is no exception to that. And I want to remind everybody, this is all a nonprofit initiative. We rely on your support. If you're ever interested in sponsoring a class or sponsoring a program series, or even donating in honor or memory of someone, we really welcome it and greatly support it. Or even maybe consider joining the Brotherhood as a full-time member. We welcome people from all around the country and all around the world. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Devin Naar, the Isaac Alhadeff Professor of Sephardic Studies at the University of Washington, a man who obviously you all know and love, and I'm sure you know and needs no introduction as well. Nevertheless, he'll have an amazing one, and he's now most recently working on a new book basically based around Sephardic Jewry, immigration, and race in the United States, which this lecture takes bits and pieces of, so you get a taste of what this forthcoming book will have in store for us. So without further ado, I'll invite Dr. Naar. Please begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ethan, for the opportunity to address the Hermandad community and the broader public out there. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and many new names out there. I'm very glad that many of you have come for our second installment of this program on Sephardic Jews and race in the United States. And I'd like to extend my gratitude not only to Ethan and to the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, but also to the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation for making this program possible. I'd like to begin our session today by speaking to you a little bit about my grandfather, my nono. And, you know, it was speaking to my grandfather, my nono, that I really began to develop a greater interest in the experience of Sephardic Jews in the United States and beyond, especially his home city of Salonika. And, you know, I've been doing this almost now for 20 years, which is hard to believe, but it's only within the last couple of months that I came across this document here, which is his high school yearbook entry from 1938. And there are a couple of things about this this yearbook entry that I find pretty interesting that I would like to elaborate on. Not only did they spell his name Isidore wrong, he spelled it with an I, but more interestingly, for our purposes, thinking about Sephardic Jews and race in America and the experience of immigration, is this quote that he had as like his little tagline. They laughed at Christopher Columbus, so never mind if they laugh at you, okay? It's very fascinating. I mean, many things I didn't know. I didn't know he was interested in photography. I didn't know a number of things here, but this quote really struck me. I don't know if anybody's familiar with films from the 1930s, but this is a quote from a song from a Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire song and dance number from the film Shall We Dance, which was came out in 1937, and it was reached very high on the on number 6 on the Billboard charts. And it goes like, the lyrics are like this. It goes, the odds were 100 to 1 against me. The world thought the heights were too high to climb. Oh, I wasn't a bit concerned, for from history I had learned how many, many times the worm had turned. They all laughed at Christopher Columbus when he said the world was round. They all laughed when Edison recorded sound, and it gives a few other examples like that. Then it said, they all said we never could be happy. They laughed at us and how, but ho, 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 who's got the last laugh now? So I find this song and this line kind of pretty interesting for a number of reasons. Okay, it was written by the Gershwin brothers. So these are Ashkenazi Jews born, with American born, but with roots in the Russian Empire. And then you got Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire in the film performing it. But this idea of kind of like the odds being against you, yet sort of prevailing and succeeding, really struck me, and especially in relationship to the idea of Christopher Columbus. And I see this as kind of maybe a little bit of a riddle. Like of all Christopher Columbus is mentioned, and Edison is mentioned. There are a bunch of other famous people who are mentioned. Why did he pick Christopher Columbus? Is there a particular relevance to Christopher Columbus as opposed to somebody else to refer to as my grandfather being a Sephardic Jew experiencing the first half of the 20th century? In the United States, which was one, as we explored last time, that was articulated according to a variety of different systems that were not set up with people with roots in the Ottoman Empire to become active members of that society, let alone a variety of other people. The other piece here is this idea of future, business. And this is something that I do associate my grandfather with. I do associate Nono with. He wound up being partners with a series of his brothers in a couple business enterprises related to food. So there was the Naar brothers Foods, which was him and his older brother Chaim, Harry. And then there was later Naar-Best food products, which was with his brother, my great uncle Leon, and their nephew Morris, Ayash. And I saw the Naar-Best Foods plant in its final iteration in the 1980s. And, they started out, my grandfather started out, he was delivering butter and eggs in his truck and later cheeses, even had sold ham at a certain point, although they never ate it. And Naar-Best, this food company, wound up getting involved in manufacturing coleslaw, potato salad, macaroni salad, jellos, all the things that you associate exactly with Sephardic food, right? No, not at all. These are like, American foods. I mean, Jello, what's more, American pie and maybe Jello. This is like very American food here. And eventually that enterprise became certified kosher. And everybody in the family got involved in the family food business. All the brothers, my father's generation, everybody was like a rite of passage. Everybody worked at the Naar-Best food plant. It was not until I moved to Seattle where I caught the initial origins of the family food business. And that is right here in an advertisement I found in the Ladino press. But it was not something I found on my own. Rather, it was a dear friend and mentor, Chazan Isaac Azuz, who is the Chazan Emeritus of the Congregation Ezra Besorot in Seattle, who has contributed many items of interest to the Sephardic experience to the Sephardic Studies Program Digital Library. And among those items was an edition of Eluzero Sephardi, the Sephardic Lighthouse, which was really a literary magazine published in Ladino in New York in the 1920s. And he brought me this edition and he shows it to me and he says, "Is this your family?" And I looked at this, I couldn't believe it. This is a half-page ad on the back side cover of this magazine, and it says La Mejor Groceria Sefaradith in Harlem, the best Sephardic grocery store in Harlem on 29 East 114th Street. And it says right here, Naar Hermanos, Proprietarios. It says Naar brothers, the owners. And you say, well, how do I know? Maybe there are other Nars. Could these be my Nars or other Nars? And it says right here below, Ijos de Rabbi Binyamin Naar. And now I know this is for sure. This is my family. There's only one Chacham Binyamin Naar. What was fascinating for me to see in the 20s in Harlem, the roots of the family business enterprise. I'm going to read you a little snippet of it. En esta grocería toparesh ropas importadas de Turquía y Grecia, como quesos, cascavales, aceitunas, salados, conservas, etc., etc. In this grocery, you'll find goods that have been imported from Turkey and Greece, like cheeses, kashkaval, which is a kind of cheese, olives, salads, and conserves, like preserved things. También venden frutos y vegetales frescos de cada día. Also, they also are sold fruits and vegetables that are fresh of every day. And then it goes on to say that this is the best known grocery store in the section of Harlem. And also the perspective of the Naar brothers is to give the client is always right, essentially. And it says, finally, that they specialize in café torrado or tostado. They brew their own coffee every day and, oops. Uh-oh. What happened? Okay, sorry. Technical difficulty there. And finally, venden naranja pronta importada de Salonico. So anybody remember what naranja is? It is a bitter orange preserve it's sweetened, and it's like a conserva, a dulce, and it's imported from Salonika. So think about it. This is the grocery store. The family business in the 20s is almost 100% oriented toward the old world. This is what they're bringing to their clients, which are Sephardim in Harlem. That is their world. That is their universe. The specialty goods of the Mediterranean, of Greece and Turkey, and including stuff straight from Salonika. Fast forward, by the time I see the final iteration of this business in the 1980s, they're making American foods, right? I would say, I think this is a nice kind of symbolic representation of the transformation of navigating American society. Even if society is not necessarily set up for you, how do you find your way? What do you have to do to make yourself find success, to be seen so that you won't be laughed at? What do you have to give up? What do you have to change? What do you have to erase? What do you have to transform? My talk today will be just as much about thinking about those systems of exclusion, those unjust systems that we spoke about in the first session related to immigration and naturalization exclusions, and really the racist, baked-in racist practices and policies of this country, and match that with a story today I'd like to show of tenacity, of creativity, of imagination, and of perseverance. And it calls to mind for me a Ladino refrán, a proverb, which says, "Déjame entrar, me hallaré lugar." Let me enter, and I will find a place for myself. Okay? How in this world do you find a way and make a way for yourself? Déjame entrar, me hallaré lugar. Let me in and I will make a place for myself. I would just like to add that this grocery store business was well expanded beyond the members of my immediate family. Even my great-grandfather, the rabbi, his brothers were also involved in the grocery business. Here it is in New Brunswick. You can see even the title of their business here is in Ladino and Hebrew letters. Groceria Parisiana, the Paris grocery, back in World War I. And this is my great-uncle, my great-great-uncle, I guess, Avram Alberto. And it is said, was an upholsterer in the Sultan's palace before coming to Salonika, where he took up the work in the grocery store here. So today we are going to look at the second part of our three-part series. We are going to look at how Sephardic Jews in the United States navigated the system in America, and how they did so, especially with reference to two kinds of institutions, mutual aid organizations and the Ladino newspapers. How did they navigate this system? Thinking about, they start relatively low in this racial hierarchy that we looked at earlier that was established by the United States government. Sometimes they were identified as Turkish, that places them quite low here. Sometimes they were identified as Hebrew, that brings them up a little bit here. What we're going to see here is how Sephardic Jews wind up trying to navigate the system and raise their status within the framework that was operative at the time. We are going to look at how Sephardic Jews in the United States actually came to call themselves and be called Sephardic Jews as opposed to something else. We already looked last time at how other terms had been used by Sephardic Jews and by others to identify them. We looked at terms like Levantine Jews, Oriental Jews, Turkish Jews, and others. Why did Sephardic Jews win out? And we're going to look at this process through these two kinds of institutions, the mutual aid organizations and the Ladino press. We got to start, though, back in the 19th century with the first arrival of Jews from the Ottoman Empire to the United States. And what's very, very important to emphasize in this context is that some of the very first Jews who came to the United States from the Ottoman Empire did so specifically as representatives of the Ottoman Empire, as agents of the Ottoman Sultan, and as representatives of the Muslim world, where it was a Jewish firm that was commissioned by the Sultan to represent the Ottoman Empire on the world stage at the Chicago's Columbian Exhibition in 1893. And here we're back to Columbus. This is the 400th anniversary of Columbus's encounter with the Americas. It has often been known as the discovery of America. Perhaps it's better to be described as the conquest of America, the subjugation and erasure of the indigenous peoples. Well, anyhow, at this time in 1893, the 400th anniversary of this instance was in which Ottoman Jews were representing the Sultan. And here we can see faraway Moses, who is said to have been Mark Twain's tour guide in Constantinople. We have Rosa, the Turkish dancer, and we have an interior of what was referred to as the Turkish mosque. All of these things, faraway Moses was Jewish, Rosa, the Turkish dancer, was a Jewish woman, but identified as a Turkish dancer. And this mosque that was built in Chicago, it is the first mosque that is built in the United States, and it was built mostly by Ottoman Jews. It was built by Ottoman Jews who used that mosque to pray the service of Yom Kippur during the Yamim Noraim in 1893. I bring this up as a way to show that when the first Ottoman Jews came to the United States, they were not presenting themselves as Sephardic Jews or as Spanish Jews, but they were presenting themselves as deeply tied and embedded in the broader Ottoman experience of which they were representing there at Chicago. They introduced to the American public things like baklava and yogurt and the mechanized cigarette rolling machine. Was very popular at the time, and Ottoman tobacco became a major enterprise, especially in the wake of the Civil War, in the United States. So here we have sort of the first imprint that Sephardic Jews make in the United States is as representatives of the Ottoman Empire. This is going to cause some tensions for the Ottoman Jews who would come over the course of the subsequent years. Many of these earlier merchants would return, they'd go back, they made money, they go back. But really toward the beginning of the 20th century, and especially with a series of wars in the Ottoman Empire that would result in the empire's dissolution, many more Jews from that region come to the United States. And they discover something to their chagrin that they are not recognized as Jews in the United States, having been 100% Jews in their empire of origin. And here we have a kind of representation of what these Jews were perceived to be by other Jews, already established Jews in the United States. And that is as essentially strangers. And here we have a passage from a entry in the Immigrants in Review magazine from 1916. Who are these strangers who can be seen in the ghetto of the Lower East Side, sitting outside of coffee houses, smoking strange-looking water pipes, sipping dark liquid from tiny cups, and playing a game of checkers and dice, a game that we are not familiar with? See the signs on these institutions. They read Café Constantinople, Café Oriental, Café Smyrna, and there are other signs in Hebrew characters that you perhaps cannot read. Are they Jews? No, it cannot be. They do not look like Jews. They do not speak Yiddish. Listen, what is that strange tongue they are using? It sounds like Spanish or Mexican. Are they Spaniards or Mexicans? If so, where did they get the coffee houses? An importation from Greece and Turkey. And it's this kind of puzzling picture, the constellation of places of origin, names, language, cultural practices, right? The tiny cups. What are they drinking out of tiny cups? They're drinking coffee. What is the game that they're playing? They're playing tavla or backgammon, right? Something that really distinguished them from the already established Jewish communities in the United States at that time, who saw the newcomers as not only different, but also perhaps even unbridgeably different. This initial sense of ostracism that the Ottoman-born Jews experienced in the United States resulted in them creating their own rich institutional life. Now, it's not that some of these early Sephardic Jews were not interested in participating in general American Jewish life, but they encountered many obstacles, not only trying to explain to the general Jewish world that they too were Jews, and these stories were replicated all across the country, in New York to Seattle and many places in between, when Ottoman-born Jews go to Eastern European Jewish people in their new places of residence, and they say, hey, I'm Jewish, you're Jewish, we should have something in common, and they are essentially rejected. They are rejected. And this is really nothing to the fault of the Ottoman Jews. It's really a lack of imagination on the part of the already established Jewish communities, which were not aware necessarily of the Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire, or chose to exclude them from their understanding of American Jewish life. And we're going to return to that in a moment. The idea of creating your own institutions was something that was completely normal at this time. The expectation, as one of the main sociologists of the era described, was that language really was the key to understanding immigrant identity at this time, because you needed to communicate with your community in order to make your way in America. He describes here that each of the cities are sort of mosaics of little language colonies, cultural enclaves, each maintaining its separate communal existence. Each one of these little communities is certain to have some sort of cooperative or mutual aid society, very likely a church, by which he means a religious institution, a school, possibly a theater, and almost invariably a press. In the city of New York, there's no language group so insignificant that it does not maintain a printing press and publish some sort of periodical. And these are the institutions, and we're not going to be able to look at them all. I'm going to focus on mutual aid societies, briefly mention church, synagogue, and also the press, but you'll have to have me back to talk about the schools or the theater. We just received a wonderful unpublished Ladino theater script written by a Jewish woman from Istanbul that was performed on the Lower East Side of New York. It's like a family drama in 3 acts by Esther Cohen. Marvelous. What was this sociologist's understanding of these language groups? And here, look at all these different people, all these different immigrant groups, and I want to point out something fascinating. There's only one group of all of these groups that gets an adjective attached to them to explain who they are. And that is the Levantine Jews. There are Jews and there are Levantine Jews. In other words, when Ottoman Jews arrived in this country, they were thinking of themselves 100% as Jews. And in their world, what did it mean to be Jewish? It meant to speak Ladino. It meant to be Sephardi. It meant to speak Hebrew, use Hebrew in the liturgy and use melodies in certain kinds of ways, to eat certain kinds of foods, to have certain kinds of names and surnames and naming practices. We call the language of the Sephardim Ladino now, but back in the Ottoman Empire, back in the day, they called it the Jewish language. Hablas Judeo or Judaismo. Do you speak Jewish? But they came to the United States and they discovered that that name and that identity was already taken by somebody else, especially by Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews. You know, in Yiddish, Yiddish means Jewish. So when you say, does somebody speak Yiddish, you're saying, do they speak Jewish? And so Ottoman Jews arriving in the United States discovered that this identity group was already taken. And they were going to become a related but differently identified group. In this instance, they are going to be identified as Levantine Jews. And the fact that the Ashkenazi Jews don't even need to be named as Ashkenazi Jews or as Yiddish-speaking Jews or as Eastern European Jews or as Central European Jews, that their particularity is unmarked. This is in some ways the definition of what some commentators refer to as Ashkenormativity, the idea that the normative way of being Jewish is being Ashkenazi. It is being imbued with Yiddish culture or Eastern European practice. It's matzah balls and gefilte fish, right? It's not keftikas and borekas, right? So within this framework, Ottoman Jews decided to, and were in some ways forced to, establish their own institutions to make their way in this country. One of the main things that they do eventually is they create synagogues. They establish more than 20 in New York City alone, and many across the country. And here you can see a sampling of some of those congregations. Up and down the Eastern Shoreboard and in the Midwest, all the way to the West Coast. Okay, Seattle being well represented here. And they established mutual aid societies like the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. But initially, all of these organizations, and this was a universal principle for immigrant groups, they established their organizations according to the principle of what is called in Ottoman Turkish, and it was used in Ladino occasionally, hemşirelik, local affiliation. Okay, so they didn't create associations for Ottoman Jews or for Levantine Jews or for Sephardic Jews. They established associations and organizations for groups based on their particular town of origin. And here you can see a sampling of some of those locales that were represented in the case of New York. And some of these groups would also form organizations and congregations across the country. The Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the sponsoring organization of these talks, was initially established in 1915 as the Salonician Brotherhood of America. And here you can see that the American identity is already being represented here in their brochure from their second annual gala in 1917 with the eagle and the American flags and everything like that. What is the purpose of these organizations, these mutual aid societies? It is to help the members navigate the American system, to navigate American society, to promote the industrial, social, and educational and religious welfare of its members, and to engage in philanthropic endeavors for the welfare of Sephardic immigrants, and to assist them in becoming naturalized, because as we saw last time, that was a big enterprise, and to promote and cultivate the study of literature, art, and the sciences. And actually, in some ways, this is what separated the Salonician Brotherhood from some of these other organizations, because it had a very strong emphasis right from the beginning, not only on mutual aid and welfare, not only on the processes of Americanization, which is, teaching their members how to become American, how to do your best job of acting and walking down the streets like a white person, is essentially what that meant, but also to develop an interest and study of literature and the arts. The press was also instrumental in helping this process of navigation. And after Salonika, Istanbul, and Izmir, New York became the place that was home to the most number of Ladino publications in the history of Ladino publishing. There were 17 Ladino newspapers and magazines published in the United States, 15 of which were in New York, one in Los Angeles, and one even in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And I brought to you here three of the most, what I consider to be the most important. La America, which was the first, and it was of general interest, but also had a kind of Zionist orientation, and it tried to bring news and provide information for Sephardic immigrants to navigate their new experience in the United States. And if you'll notice here, the title of this, the newspaper is the Oriental Printing and Publishing Company, okay? So the term Oriental is initially being used in this magazine. And that's going to be very, very important for our purposes here. Now, if we take a look at this next one, La Voz del Pueblo, this was a socialist magazine, but also one that was a communal magazine as well. Pardon me, a weekly newspaper. And it was founded by a gentleman from Salonika, Maurice Nessim, who was very involved in the Sephardic Brotherhood. And we're going to talk more about him and more about socialism and Sephardic politics in the third session next week. Okay, and the final one I want to mention for you was La Vara. And I would consider La Vara to be the most important of all of the Ladino newspapers published in the United States. It was the longest lasting. It was the last Ladino newspaper published anywhere in the world to be published in the traditional Hebrew letters, as you see here. And it was also satirical, carrying on the strong tradition of satire that was developed by the Ladino newspaper publishing industry in Salonika. And you can see here an angel beating a man. One of their main early tasks was to call out the hypocrisy of the people who purported to be the leaders of the community, the Ish Betirajis, the people who thought they were the big guys, the guys who were getting everything done. This newspaper was going to call them to task, in addition to sharing the news of the community and also to pushing a political agenda. Many of the early members of and leaders of this newspaper were also socialist in their political orientation, and it had a massive subscription rate of as many as 16,500 in the middle of the 1920s. We're talking about perhaps 50,000 Ladino-speaking Jews in the United States by this time, so there were a lot of people reading this newspaper all across the country and even beyond. And this was the case for all of those Ladino newspapers. They had subscribers all throughout the United States and beyond, and they even had representatives and agents. You know, you could go to your local agent, you could buy the newspaper, you get a subscription, and you could really participate in hearing, in reading, and contributing to the community voice all across the dispersed, as they called themselves, Turkino colonies. And this was really the main designating term that they referred to themselves, regardless of where they specifically came from. They were from Rhodes or Salonika or Izmir or Istanbul or Çorlu. They all were within the framework of the Turkinos, by which they meant essentially Ottomans. This was the Ladino way to refer to themselves as citizens of the Ottoman Empire now dispersed in the United States. And here you can see, for example, an advertisement for the Sultan's coffee, which, it says here, Mercad Café donde mercan todos los turquinos. Buy coffee where all the Turquinos buy it. And this is on Rivington Street on the Lower East Side. Okay? But you can see, again, look at the geographic expanse here, from the West Coast to the Midwest and even beyond. They don't even observe national boundaries here. You have Havana, Cuba is positioned right in between Philadelphia and Portland. You got Buenos Aires, you have Monastir, which is Bitola in today's former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. You have Rhodes, you have Usku, Bulgaria. Okay, a wide variety of people connected to each other through the Ladino press. Okay, but it was also through the Ladino press and through the leaders of these institutions that Ottoman-born Jews sought to make their first overtures toward the already established Ashkenazi Jewish community. And I bring for you another text that was shared with me by Hazan Isaac Azuz. And what's really amazing about this text here is there's really only one full copy of it that we know of, which is, you're looking at a scan of it. But this was a guide for Sephardic immigrants in the United States. And what's fascinating about this text from World War I is that on the inside front cover, you've got an advertisement for phonographes. If you're of a certain generation, you might remember what that might be, a phonograph, a record. What's fascinating about this advertisement for records is it says that you can buy records in cantes en todas las lenguas, records with songs in all of the languages. What are all of the languages for Ottoman Jews coming to the United States around the time of World War I? Español, by which they mean Ladino, Turco, Turkish, Grego, Greek, and Arabo, Arabic. Those are the languages. And those would be the languages with which you would want to be hearing songs that would make you have a sense of connectivity with the old world that you had left behind coming to the United States. The guide goes on to describe the process of immigration to the United States. You will get on El Vapor de la Salvación, the ship of salvation that will bring you from the Orient to America, and you will disembark at Ellis Island. You will probably be in prison there, and hopefully eventually you will be liberated if you are not deported. And then you will come to the United States, into the city of New York, and you will see these huge buildings that you've never seen such buildings so big before. And what do you call these big buildings in Ladino? They are called skyscrapers. So that's, it's a living language. It incorporated English into it as well. Okay. Gadol, the editor of La America, who put out this guide for Sephardic immigrants, he provided translations of the naturalization laws and the immigration laws, again, to help the new immigrants navigate their new society. But he also said that for Sephardim to succeed in the United States, they had to learn not one, but two new languages. He believed that in order to become real Americans, they had to learn English, because English was the language of the country. And in order to become connected with and part of the American Jewish community, he believed that the Sephardim needed to learn Yiddish. He writes somewhere in his newspaper that the Ashkenazim have been speaking Yiddish for 1,000 years, and they're going to continue to speak Yiddish for 1,000 more. He was only off by like 970 years. I mean, other than some specific enclaves of Yiddish-speaking Jews in New York and in Israel and elsewhere. But so what he provides you with is a guide for words and conversations. So you can, if you know Ladino, you will see them in Ladino in the column here, what he calls Español, and then in English, in Hebrew letters. So if you don't know how to read English, you can sound it out. Good day, sir, it says. And then in what he calls Yiddish here. And he provides you it in his version of Yiddish, which it turns out is not really Yiddish, but really more like German that he wrote in Hebrew letters. So his effort to teach the Sephardim Yiddish, it didn't get very far. But the English turned out to be very, very, very important part of the process. The encounter with the Yiddishim would very much shape the way in which Sephardic Jews would try to position themselves in the United States. And it was not only with the Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, but also with regard to the much better established uptown German origin Jews, as well as the much even more established Jews of Spanish and Portuguese origin who were connected to Congregation Shereth Israel uptown and had traced their roots to the colonial era in the United States. But look at the rhetoric that the Levantine Jews, that the Ottoman Jews are confronted with when they begin to arrive in greater numbers in the United States during the Balkan Wars in 1913. Like essentially one of the, what we might call like the equivalent of one of the major federations, Jewish federations, calls a conference to essentially try to figure out what are we going to do with this problem of Oriental immigration within the framework of the United States. They say, look, these Jews, they are so different from us. What are we going to do with them? Do they belong within the framework of our community? Are they just on their own? So the National Conference of Jewish Charities emphasized that the psychic and psychological difference between the Levantine Jew and our Russian, Austrian, and Romanian co-religionists, it's so vast, so great is the difference that there seems to be little in common. The points of similarity are few. The Levantine Jew is as human, or almost as human, as any other. And this dehumanizing rhetoric, I mean, literally, he's saying they're not quite humans in the way that we're humans. Our Jews, this is replicating the rhetoric that was in play in the United States already at this time, that saw European people, white people, as the only people who were on track to claim their full humanity, and those lower down, those on the cusp of Europe, those in the Muslim world, those beyond, were not fully human in the way that white and European people were. And the established Jewish community is internalizing that rhetoric and projecting it onto the other Jews within. It's also a sign of their own vulnerability. There was a lot of anti-Semitism at this time. Immigration restriction is pitched to try to exclude Eastern European Jews from coming to this country. And so this may be also part of a strategy on the part of Eastern European Jews to say, hey, look, you may not be interested, you real white Americans, the US government, in welcoming more Jews into this country who you see as Semites, who you see as Oriental, who you see as not fully civilized. They say, oh, no, we are the European ones. There are others that who could be perhaps the target of your animosity. They are not us. They are them. We see this even with the rabbi of Congregation Shereth Israel, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. Here he uses the terms the Balkan Jew. The Balkan Jew lacks even the energy and intense ambition which animates even the poorest Eastern European Jew. The striving to better his lot is not very powerful. This is pretty degrading kind of language. And it explains in part why that same sociologist I referred to earlier, Park, he writes that Levantine Jews feel more discrimination from the other wings of the Jews than they do from the non-Jews. And part of the problem is because those other Jews are concerned about what the association of these new coming Jews from the Muslim world will do to their own status. They will see these newcomers, they will see them in their clothes, they will see them in their language, they will see them in their culture, they will see them, and they are afraid that it may negatively impact their own position in American society. So here you can see some depictions. Type of Oriental Jew who speaks the strange language, Ladino, okay? Another of the Spanish Jews who do not come from Spain, and this is going to be a very important point of contention. They may claim to be Spanish Jews, but they're not really Spanish Jews. They are Oriental Jews, they're Eastern Jews, they're Levantine Jews. Or here, women will become a very important part of the debate. Concerns that the Sephardic women, and there will be all these kinds of like race science oriented arguments about are the Oriental Jews, are they really like Turks and Arabs? Are they really, in terms of their physiognomy and their appearance and their racial structure and their intellectual capabilities, are they like Europeans? Are they Spanish? You can find dozens and dozens and dozens of articles in the press, in the American press, in the Yiddish press, in the Ladino press, debating the status of these Levantine Jews, okay? So what do the Ottoman Jews do in response to this sense of denigration and distance? Is they actually launch a campaign. They launch a campaign to try to argue that they are Sephardim and they are Spanish Jews. And we can see this emerge during World War I in the Ladino press, where in La America and even El Progreso, which is the predecessor of La Voz del Pueblo, a socialist magazine, the socialist newspaper, they are arguing that community, stop calling yourselves Oriental Jews, stop calling yourselves Levantine Jews, don't call yourselves Turks, don't call yourselves Ottomans, call yourselves Sephardim, call yourselves Spanish. And one of the kickoffs to this campaign emerges in the form of a poem. And we have here the last stanza of the poem, but I want to set up the poem for you. It describes an encounter between an Ottoman Jew and a Yiddish-speaking Jewish young man on the Lower East Side of New York. And this youth from the Ottoman Empire is wearing a jubeh, like an Ottoman-style robe that would mark him off as, from the old country. And he meets this, he's dressed, a la turca in the Turkish style, and he meets this Yiddish-speaking man, and he's asked, who are you? Who are you? And the Ottoman-born Jew tries a couple of different designations. He says, I'm an Oriental Jew. And he says, well, no, I'm a Spanish Jew. I'm a Jew from Turkey. And then he says, no, I'm a Jewish Oriental. Tries all these different kinds of categories. And the Yiddish-speaking Jew says, no, none of these make any sense to me. Or if they do make sense, these are bad things to be. Right? He says, in the Orient, what does it mean to be from the Orient? You from the Far East or the Near East? Turkey, this evokes the idea of the terrible Turk. Where's your scimitar? You need a big mustache. Where's your fez? And the author of the poem, that's when he interjects and he says, man, don't you know that the Americans, by which he means white Americans, do not get along with the Orientals, seeing that they think we are Chinese or from Japan, or that we wear fezes? So in other words, we see a process of distance yourself from these other categories. These are not doing you any favors in the United States. It's not good to be Asian. It's not good to be Turkish. We are Sephardim since birth. Now, what's fascinating about this poem and the broader campaign that it encapsulates is that I would argue that it was not self-evident for the Ottoman-born Jews to think of themselves as Sephardim since birth. They did not necessarily consider themselves with this term exclusively, and certainly not necessarily as Sephardim. The youth in the poem could not even come up with the term. The assertions that they don't wear fezes and we have never been anything but Sephardim since our birth were really aspirations rather than a representation of the underlying social reality. The purpose of this campaign was to provide Ladino-speaking Jews with the idiom, the vocabulary, the tools to better position themselves vis-a-vis the Ashkenazi Jewish dominant culture in the United States and the American public more generally, to connect them to the grandeur of medieval Spain. They want to show that, look, we are not backwards, we are not uncivilized, we are the heirs of Maimonides, of the great thinkers of medieval Spain, the great Jewish thinkers of medieval Spain. And they want to show to white America that, look, we're not from the backwards Middle East. We are really in our origin, in our essence, in our racial composition, using the language of the day, we are Spanish. And we deserve a sense of legitimacy and the kind of dignity that goes with that title. Okay? This was the way that they felt they could gain a sense of authenticity and a sense of recognition and stave off that the kind of denigrating remarks and discourses of which they had been the target. What this requires, however, is completely transforming and rewriting their own narrative. Remember when those first Ottoman Jews came to the United States in 1893 as representatives of the Sultan, claiming to be Ottomans? They were there, waving the Ottoman flag, literally building a mosque. You get many articles in the Ladino press saying, now is the time to renounce those identities. And here's one of the arguments. Look, they're very creative in the way that they think about it. We are Sephardim, not Orientals. They say the Spanish language and the land of Spain are not Oriental, and similarly, the official language in Turkey is not Spanish. And we who arrived here to the United States, immigrants from Turkey, were there in Turkey merely as guests for 400 years. So they rewrite their narrative. We are no longer integral components of the Ottoman society, which is the argument they were making 30 years before. But now we're saying, no, we were just guests. We were just passing through. We were just passing through. We're really from Spain. Our language is Spanish. And of course, the irony is that in that Spanish language, the term he uses for guest is the Turkish origin term, musafires. So, that Ottoman influence really did rub off, okay? This discourse of saying, okay, we need to reposition ourselves if we're going to get some legitimacy in American society, which has those specific racial hierarchies that we've been looking at. We need to position ourselves as Spanish, and we need to position ourselves in the Jewish context as Sephardic Jews. What does this do? Especially during World War I, this leads almost to a complete renunciation of their previous allegiance to the Ottoman Empire. And here you can see even as far afield as Seattle, published in the Seattle Star, which eventually merged with the Seattle Times. Look at this. With the hope that the war may overthrow the Mohammedan rule in Turkey, the Muslim rule in Turkey, Turkish Jews in Seattle have subscribed $4,000 to the Third Liberty Loan, which is like, to support the American war effort. Their wives are actively engaged in the Red Cross. Now, this is completely normal. It makes perfect sense. They're trying to demonstrate that they are part of the American fabric. They're also afraid of their association with Turkey because Turkey is allied with Germany and Germany is the bad guy and Turkey is the bad guy. And there were even official discussions in the American government about what to do with citizens of the Ottoman Empire who were living in the United States. There was even discussion of rounding them up as enemy aliens and possibly deporting them or imprisoning them. Now, that never came to pass, but the threat itself was enough to say, look, we don't want to be associated with this geography anymore. We're going to associate ourselves with a place that's going to give us a little bit more legitimacy in the American and the American Jewish environment. The results of this campaign are many. First of all, there was a lot of resistance, I would say. Some of the Ottoman Jews were against taking on the name Sephardi. They said, why do we call ourselves Sephardim? We are Jews, sons of Jews, not Spaniards. Right? Others objected to what they saw as kind of the unifying effort of the Sephardic campaign that was initiated by Moïse Gadol because they weren't interested in the Zionist underpinnings of his enterprise. But many of them did see the benefits. And so we see one of the results of this campaign is the Salonician Brotherhood of America by the end of World War I, just after it changes its name. It becomes the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. And subsequently, after World War II, became the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. But here at this time, after World War I, now there's the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. That term Sephardic is very, very important for them. It connects them to the grandeur of the medieval Spanish Jewish thinkers and sages. It connects them to Europe. It connects them to whiteness in the American imagination. At least that's what they hope. But the campaign is not so successful. They get a change in name, but not necessarily in content. We have a series of articles that emerge in the American press. And I'm going to conclude with looking at this controversy and responses to it about how Sephardic Jews are depicted in the 1920s. Remember, this is the height of race science in the United States. This is in the wake of immigration restriction that is implemented to exclude and minimize the number of Jews coming from Eastern European countries. And we see some really fascinating racialized rhetoric at play in the American Jewish establishment. I want to bring to your attention a very infamous report from the 20s by a gentleman named Louis Hacker, who was commissioned essentially by what is the Jewish Federation of New York to figure out, all right, it's been now 15 years since these Ottoman Jews have been in this country. What is going on with them? What is their status? They are separate from us. Why? Should we be doing something to address their plight? And I want to emphasize that Hacker was not nobody. He was a Columbia-educated guy. He became a dean at Columbia University, and he also became a personal friend of President Eisenhower. So he's not nobody, okay? He begins to study essentially by saying that Sephardic Jews are as alien to their Ashkenazi kinsmen as are the Negroes to the average white Southerner. Think about what this means in the 1920s, in a world of racial segregation, a world of Jim Crow, a world in which it is illegal for Black people and white people to marry. Coming from the Levant, their way of life differs radically from an Occidental point of view. Again, it's this East-West dichotomy. Their diets from the Mohammedan lands have encouraged separate eating houses. He has a whole thing about how it's not good to eat vegetables and fish, by the way. And it causes the inferior status of the women folk because the women prepare vegetables, principally vegetables and fish, for their men. So the gender dynamic of this report is fascinating. and it impacts their general mental attitudes. They are the products of old world localism, fed by a natural conservatism, a suspicion easily aroused, and a fondness for casuistry that is one of the distinguishing marks of the Oriental. The Sephardic Jew is not educated according to our standards, though he is conversant with Ladino, Greek, Arabic, French, Turkish, French, and Italian. He can speak these languages. He cannot, as a rule, write them. Demagoguery thrives on the general illiteracy. There's no medium for Jewish or Sephardic cultural expression. Libel, and these were lies. These were lies. We're getting some scribbles over here. Okay. What does he conclude? He says, I see somebody's raising their hand. We'll get to you with questions at the end. He says, what is the solution? How do we address this radically different? Okay. I think we lost the share screen there. What do we do?
Sorry about that.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. What is the response? What is the response? He says, this guy, Louis Hacker, he says, our best hope is that if we, the European Jews, spend enough time with these Oriental Jews, we will help civilize them and accustom to our own ways so that they will slough off the practices and cultures that are derived from their proximity to blacks and their proximity to Muslims. He said the best way to do that is through interbreeding with them that will eventually select out, I mean, this is the eugenics logic of the time, will select out these deleterious genetic markers that they have accrued through their association with Africa and the Middle East. And he says, even if that happens, it's not clear whether we will be able to redeem them and whether they will be suitable for participation in the American Jewish community and in the American society more broadly. Okay? Think about that. I mean, it is a remarkable, damning statement that really reflects more on the position of the author and the vulnerability that he has experienced in his community as Ashkenazi Jews than it reflects on the reality of Sephardic life. And this becomes a big controversy in the press. The Forward, the Jewish Daily Forward, which was the biggest Yiddish newspaper, publishes in its English section a huge expose based on this report. And look at the rhetoric here. I mean, it's really denigrating. In the old country, they, the Sephardic Jews, had no cultural life of their own worth speaking of. They had no common body of customs and traditions, no common literature, no knowledge of or curiosity about the past. They had not been revived by a great spiritual movement such as Hasidism, which rescued the Jews of Eastern Europe from stagnancy. They'd been a backward people in a backward country, and how could they hope to progress in this country? Members of the Hermandad of the Sephardic Brotherhood, contributors and editors of the Ladino press, they wrote letters to the Forward. They wrote letters to Hacker. Each of them said, oh, this is the truth. I was just trying to represent reality. And I have all the correspondence. You can read more about it in my book when it is published. But what's fascinating to me is that they did not even publish the letters to the editor, trying to defend themselves, trying to present a different picture to the story. And the sense that this report in particular did irreparable damage for the status of Sephardic Jews in the United States was still being lamented 40 and 50 years later by figures like Henry Besso and Mayor Jose Bernardete, who were some of the important intellectuals in the community at that time. They're saying, you remember the Hacker report, what he did to us, what that report stigmatized our community. And I want you to recognize that this was an internalized thing. The government is not saying this. This is like the established Jewish community, okay? The pitch then comes, they double down, the Sephardim, on trying to position themselves as part of the Spanish story as a way to get them inside the broader Jewish story, because everybody knows who Maimonides is. Everybody respects Maimonides. And Spain is in Europe, and Europe, you got to be in Europe in order to make it in the United States. They recognize that. to be eligible for the rights and privileges that come with American citizenship. And so here we have Yehuda Sadi, who is a very important leader of the Sephardic Brotherhood, writing in the Depression in 1930. Look, he reiterates the argument. We are Jews like the others. And if we are still called the people of the book, we will prove it. We are not the gypsies of our people. And again, now to elevate yourself, you put down another group, okay? We have a glorious past, and we still possess the intellectual Jew, capable of drawing upon all that our ancestors have bequeathed to us. We will show to our brothers, the Ashkenazim, that the descendants of Maimonides, Ibn Gabirol, and Abravanel still count among them individuals who can become leaders of their people. And if we still have our dignity, we will show that we are the true Spanish Jews who enrich Spain with money and enrich Jews with knowledge. This is the argument that they go with. So they say, all right, fine. We will delete our lived Ottoman reality and past in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we will cling and reclaim our ancient Spanish glories. Please accept us. Please recognize us. Please see us. Please acknowledge us. I want to emphasize, concluding the final act, which brings us to Columbus. If you are toward the bottom of a hierarchy and you want to get yourself moving up in that hierarchy, how do you do it? And this was very clever on the part of Moïse Gadol and others. Ashkenazi Jews were also doing this, but Gadol takes it kind of to a new level. And he says, look, you think we're toward the bottom of the barrel, right? We're on the borderline zone of whiteness and not whiteness. He says, but no, you don't understand. If you understand who we, the Sephardim, really are, you will understand that it is us to whom you should be expressing your gratitude, white people, for enabling you to be here on this continent. And he begins his pamphlet published during World War II. Christopher Columbus was a Spanish Jew, by claiming that God placed the white race in Europe, the yellow race in Asia, the black race or Negroes in Africa, and the red race in America. But the New World is populated by all races and nationalities, the white race dominating because the discoverer of the New World was of the white race from Europe. And he goes on to say, it is that white race from Europe that brought civilization to the barbaric lands of the Americas. So it is an embrace. It is an investment in white superiority. Right? It says, yes, it doesn't say, no, the whole system, something's wrong with the system. It doesn't say something's wrong with the system. Say, I cannot change the system. I want to elevate myself within the system. How am I going to do it? I'm going to show you that this system that you white people are benefiting from, you owe me for that. So let me in. Let me in. Acknowledge me. Treat me with respect. He says, and there were a lot of theories about Columbus's origin. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the Italian origin story. Columbus Day, by the way, was in some ways a reward that the federal government gave to Italian Americans after a major lynching of Italians in the United States. So Columbus has had a very important draw. And obviously it's in the news today, but you think about the way in which they recognize here is the nature of the system. How are we going to make our way and best position ourselves within this system? So he says, Columbus was a Spanish Jew. This is a theory. It is a known theory. Unclear if there's truth to it. This is all Jews. Descendants of Cristobal Colon should be respected by all other nationalities living in this great continent. In the New World, there's no room for anti-Semitism. The Jews must be treated with equality in commemoration of the discoverer Cristobal Colon the Jew. Now it is to America to help the Jewish people. This is World War II. He says, look, why have you closed your gates to the Jews? It's because of the Jews that you're here in the first place. So open your gates, save the Jews, right? Because Christopher Columbus, discoverer of the continent, was a Marrano Jew from Spain. Since all the nations of this continent owe their freedom to Columbus the Jew, it is their duty to pay tribute to the freedom of the great Jewish nation, the martyrs of Spain in 1492, Germany and Russia today. And this in some ways brings the Sephardic campaign that was launched during World War I to compel and convince Sephardic Jews to say, you know what, scrap your Oriental identity and the category. Bring yourself into Europe. It's like a magic trick. You know, we will use new terms to define ourselves, and we will be acknowledged and we will be respected in the Jewish world and in the general American world. I wonder if this may have been something that Nono had in mind when he brought in his yearbook this quote: "They laughed at Christopher Columbus, so never mind if they laugh at you." Was this him speaking as somebody, okay, clearly a little bit, you know, on the outs in some ways, but is this actually him making a kind of allusion to his own position as a Sephardic Jew in the United States? I think we don't know the answer to it, but I found it, the timing and the imagery associated with it, to be so so poignant as to not point it out. You know, la boca hace y deshace. The mouth creates and the mouth destroys. We may think that these discussions I've been describing, Sephardic Jew, Spanish Jew, Levantine Jew, Oriental Jew, Balkan Jew, Turkino, Ottoman Jew, it's just an issue of semantics. Why are you getting so hung up on words? But words are everything in this environment, because words are categories that have legal standing and provide you with access or exclude you from certain rights and certain privileges and certain opportunities. Being classed in one category as opposed to another may be the difference between a path of success and a path of distress. This is part of the navigation of the Sephardic Jews in the first half of the 20th century. It is a story, I believe, of perseverance, of creativity. It's fascinating, the maneuvers that they made to try to make themselves make sense in American context. But it is also one in which they recognized they were operating within a system of power and hierarchy with exclusions and privileges not of their making. It is one that they sought to make the best possible lives for themselves and their families within those very confines. This was the challenge of navigation. Thank you.
Dr. Naar, thank you so much. What a beautiful presentation as always. Now we will open up the floor to questions. What I'm going to ask is that if people were interested in asking a question, please type it into the chat and we'll read them out for Dr. Naar to answer. And I'm sure we'll have plenty. We had plenty of quite great, awesome questions from last time. And I encourage you all, please ask your questions to go away. And if we don't get to yours again, I'll be sure to refer them to Professor Naar for review as well. And he'll get in touch with you. I'm sure we'll share emails, etc. So we'll start off with some questions that came a little earlier in the chat. Let's scroll up here. One question came up, which you kind of addressed a little bit, but maybe not explicitly. Do we know how the Spanish and Portuguese Jews view the Ottoman Jews who arrived in the late 1800s?
Well, you know, what's fascinating is we don't have a lot of documentation on that initial counter. Like, I do not know, for example, what the Spanish and Portuguese Jews thought of the Jewish merchants who were representing the Ottoman Empire at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. I would love to find out. Fascinating question. What I can say is that there was a lot of, a great deal of concern, shall we say, consternation, in fact, the way in which the Portuguese Jews may be impacted by these newly arriving Levantine or Ottoman Jews, how their own status as Sephardic Jews may be jeopardized. You know, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were thought of themselves as the grandees. These were the upper class kind of folks. They had been there since the 17th, 18th centuries. They were the elite within the Jewish community, and they were afraid that by association with these newcomers, their own status and reputation would be tarnished. So much so that figures like the Solopul, who I referred to before, refused to initially acknowledge and use the term Sephardic Jews to describe the newcomers from the Ottoman Empire. They said, no, Sephardic Jews, that's us, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. You can be Levantine Jews, you can be Balkan Jews, you can be Oriental Jews, not us. We don't want to be associated with you. Now that dynamic would change in the 20s, and there would be a kind of rapprochement in part because the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish communities were losing numbers in terms of members of their congregation, essentially because many of the established Spanish and Portuguese Jewish families had entered the general white Christian mainstream. And also it provided an opportunity for the Ottoman-born Jews to, in some ways, raise up their reputation and their status within the American framework.
Next question. In one of the slides, you outlined, it mentions the different immigrant groups, and you mentioned how Levantine Jews were explicitly noted separately from Jews. And Syrians are also mentioned. Does the latter refer to non-Jewish Ottoman immigrants or also Syrian Jews?
Excellent question. So what that particular sociologist meant by Syrians is unclear. Oftentimes, oftentimes the category of Oriental Jews and sometimes Levantine Jews included both Ladino-speaking Jews, Arabic-speaking Jews, and Greek-speaking Romaniot Jews. They were all kind of lumped together. And this became a kind of a problem for each of these constituents because the especially the Arabic-speaking Jews and the Ladino-speaking Jews didn't necessarily have a language in common. So the outside world, including the Jewish communal infrastructure, saying, you guys are all Oriental Jews. Like you should get together and you should figure out your own, what your own situation is. And when you figure out who you are and what you want, then come back to us. And the Arabic-speaking Jews, of which there were just some thousands, fewer, and the Greek-speaking Romanio Jews, of which there were some thousands, and the Ladino-speaking Jews said, well, hold on a second. Let's not lump ourselves all together here. So there were some very intense kind of recognition of these differentiations that went in two ways. I would say the one approach was the let's replicate this racist hierarchy among ourselves approach. And the other approach was let's build a coalition against this kind of European Jewish dominant understanding of Jewish history, of the Jewish experience in the United States. So the let's replicate the hierarchy was like, okay, you know who's at the bottom of the barrel? You might think that we, the Ladino-speaking Levantine Jews, are at the bottom of the barrel, but no, it's actually the Arabic-speaking Jews. They are even lower than us because they actually speak Arabic, right? So they, rather than say, you know what, the system, this whole hierarchy is like really messed up. Maybe we should try to counter it. They say, they do the same thing that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews did to the German Jews, and that the Spanish and Portuguese and the German Jews together did to the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews, and that all three of them did to the Ladino-speaking Jews. Now all of them did to the Arabic-speaking Jews. So that kind of dynamic is replicated. So you may see this, that even in Sephardic Jewish communities, they say, no, I'm a Spanish Jew. I'm not an Arab Jew, because that is an echo of these civilizational and racialized hierarchies that were in play 100 years ago. The coalition approach is to say, you know what, we are in this together and we're going to build a kind of a pan-Sephardic, non-Ashkenazi kind of identity, and we're going to try to build that up. And that's another approach. And there are some scholars, I think Max Daniel is working on that, among other topics.
One comment that came from one of our participants was, it was interesting that the text was written in Rashi script. And I thought this was actually a very important, I'm going to frame it as a question actually, or a comment of why that is, because I think many people don't fully understand the roots of the terminology of Rashi script. And maybe you can talk about what that script really is and why that word is kind of just not really accurate to its history.
Yeah. Can I share my screen again? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
If we go back to if we go back, where was I had an example of Rashi script, I think. Where was it? That's Meruba. Okay. Here we have a mix of scripts in this one. We have block Hebrew, and we have also.
You just need a screen share.
Oh, I didn't do my screen share? No. Oh, sorry. So here we have a mix of the block Hebrew type, and then down below we have the Rashi script. So Rashi script is a script that it's from the 16th century essentially, and it was a font type that was developed by the publishers of the Talmud, who published the page of Talmud with Rashi's commentary next to it. So Rashi was a medieval Ashkenazi commentator, very, very famous rabbinic commentator. And in many editions of the Talmud, his commentary would be appended to it. And as a kind of a way to distinguish just by eyesight, when you look at a page, to say, okay, here's the main text of the Talmud, and here's Rashi's commentary, they developed a separate kind of type font, typeface, and they called that Rashi font. And in the Ottoman Jewish world, the Rashi font became a way to also then distinguish between Hebrew, which would tend to be written in the Merubah, in the block type here, and Ladino, which would tend to be written in Rashi script. So that when you look at a text immediately, just by the font phase, the font type, you'd be able to tell what language you're going to be reading. Now in the United States, Rashi script was, the font type was much less readily available. So you see many of the Ladino newspapers would typically use the regular block type, which you can see here.
Great, thank you, Professor. Let's see. Sorry, we are getting so many questions, wonderful questions. I'm trying to get to as many as we can. Is there a specific time at which Ladino was printed in Latin characters rather than Hebrew or Rashi characters?
Well, Ladino really begins to be printed in Hebrew, pardon me, in Latin letters in the 20th century. So from the 16th century to the 20th century, from 1492 to the 20th century, almost all of the Ladino texts we have are written in Hebrew letters. And it's really as a process of being more familiar with European culture and languages, especially French and Italian, that Ladino starts to be written in Latin letters. So you may be familiar with, there are some debates, some people say, you know, there was no standardized way to write Ladino, and that's not true. There were standard ways to write Ladino in Hebrew letters, but when you render it in Latin letters, then you have to say, well, am I going to be using the French orthography system? Am I going to be using the Italian orthography system? Am I going to be using the Spanish system, English, Turkish, after Turkish is also Romanized, and in some ways Ladino follows the practices in Turkey, which Turkey, as part of its modernization effort, switches from using the Arabic script to write Turkish to using the Latin script in the 1920s, and Ladino-speaking Jews also enter that same process of using Latin letters as well. But the holdout is really in the United States and a few other places where they continue to use Ladino for the press. They use Hebrew script until the very end, 1948.
Another question here. How you mentioned this transition kind of in mentality from Oriental and Eastern and Turk and Ottoman to kind of this terminology of Sephardi or Spanish. How long did this kind of actually take in terms of transitioning, in terms of self-identity for like the average person, would you say?
It's hard to tell from the average person, but I would say within about 15 years, and certainly from the World War I to World War II, essentially during that period, the transformation is complete. Insofar as that everybody becomes familiar with the term Sephardi, they become familiar with the idea of themselves as connected to Spain. Now, that's not necessarily with regard to the exclusion of the other geographies that they themselves are from, but it does play a kind of a role in really shaping how they saw themselves. Let me give you, I'm going to see if I can give you one. I have really one maybe interesting example here that I didn't get to show. I'm going to share my screen again, if that's okay.
Please.
So Maurice Abravanel was from Salonika, and somebody may be familiar with him. He was a very famous conductor. He comes to the United States, he claims to be Portuguese, and like in his official biography, it doesn't mention that he's Jewish. This is in the University of Utah. The Abravanel Symphony Hall is what the Symphony Hall in Salt Lake City is called, of all places. And what's fascinating in his biography, check it out. The association is there. Maurice Abravanel was born in Thessalonica, Greece. He was actually never stepped foot in that city when it was Greece. He was born in the Ottoman Empire and lived there when it was part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, he is descendant of Don Isaac Abravanel, who, as finance minister chancellor to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel of Spain, arranged in 1492 the funding for the first voyage of Christopher Columbus to the Americas. Same rhetoric that I was referring to. So like it was a strategic deployment. So like what stories you might tell in your family versus what stories you might tell to the public might be different stories. They might resonate, they might be competing. But I would say that over the course of 20 years, no Ottoman-born Jew is no longer saying, I'm not Sephardic, I'm an Ottoman Jew. I mean, the Ottoman Empire is done by the time. It's very clear that terms like Oriental are not doing them any favors. And it also explains why all other non-Ashkenazi Jews will also take on the title of Sephardim. I mean, it becomes a kind of cognate for non-Ashkenazi Jews in this kind of bifurcated world that we have, both in the United States and other places of the world. You know, all non-Ashkenazi Jews can take on the name Sephardi or the Sephardim, a wide variety of different kinds of groups.
Oops. I mean, you actually hit the kind of some part of the next point we're going to ask, which is perfect. What sort of connections were there between the Arabic-speaking Ottoman Jewish arrivals and the Ladino-speaking Ottoman arrivals in the 20th century? And what can we draw from this history that is relevant for the history of the quote-unquote Mizrahi Jewish American experience?
It's a really great question. And you know, the experience of Arabic-speaking Jews in the United States, I mean, the extent to which Ladino-speaking Jews in the United States is not a well-studied subject. The experience of Arabic-speaking Jews in the United States is even less well-studied. I mean, there's no history of that community. There's been some sociological and anthropological work, but no history of this community, which is really fascinating. And I think it would tell us a lot. I think it would tell us a lot about the way in which this sort of chain of Orientalism, this chain of racial hierarchizing was yet again internalized, right? I mean, there would be both bonds that would be built among Ladino-speaking Jews and Arabic-speaking Jews. I'm going to talk a little bit about that next time in this early period, but there was also a sense of distance. I found many examples of Ladino-speaking Jews as part of their process of proving that they are European and that they are Spanish by showing and saying, look, at least we're not Arabic-speaking Jews, or we're not like the Arabic-speaking Jews, or at least we're not Arabs. Like, this is rhetoric you can find. And it's, I mean, in some ways, I'm not trying to place a value judgment. I'm just trying to explain this as part of the mechanism that, again, when you are confronting a system in the United States, which is legally instituted that privileges whiteness and Europeanness and Christianity, in order to make your way in that system, you might make choices that might wind up putting others down in order for you to raise yourself up. That's this kind of system that we have here.
Thank you, Devin. What else? We have so many. Again, I apologize, we're not going to be able to get to everybody's questions. So many wonderful questions, but we're going to be sure to send all the questions and comments to Professor Naar to hopefully try to follow up. One question here, which is very interesting: was it the Holocaust that finally conjoined these separate Jewish communities? Was there any, by which I believe he means the different Sephardic communities within the, the Salonikans, the Israelis, etc. And was there any criticism of racial hierarchy by the socialist Ladino press, as a follow-up question?
Great. Okay. So I would first say that we can disaggregate, and I received a private question about this, in certain places, and I think to a certain degree in New York, but especially in a place like Seattle and Atlanta, the initial bonds that were built between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews were specifically with the German Reform Jewish communities. And I think that that's very, very important to recognize. And I think part of that has to do with the importance of the grandeur and the sort of the legacy of medieval Spanish Jewish thinkers and practices and texts for the foundation of the Reform movement. The Reform movement in the 19th century, emerging out of Germany, models itself on medieval Spanish Jewry. There is kind of like almost an obsession with medieval Spanish Jewish thinkers, practices, traditions, and this idea that just like we as German Jews are going to try to perfectly balance our Germanness and our Jewishness, the only model that we have are the Spanish Jews, who are the only other community in Jewish history that was able to be like fully Spanish and fully Jewish, full participants in their general society, yet also fully Jewish. So there's this kind of pre-established, predisposed interest among German Jewish communities, among Reformed Jewish communities, with regard to Sephardic Jews. So I think that the initial bonds that are built between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, if we use those broad terms, are between German Jews and Reform congregations. You see this most specifically in a place like Atlanta, and also in Seattle, and perhaps elsewhere. You can have me back. I can give talks on all the different places. That would be great. But I would say that that's the first place to go. And you can even see another place where you see a lot of connections between Levantine Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, specifically with Romanian Jews. Specifically Romanian Jews, because Romanian Jews are the only Ashkenazi Jews that historically eat eggplant. And this, for whatever reason, was a major kind of zone of contact and appreciation. Alberto Amato, who was the first non-Salonican president of the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, and Rachel Amato Bortnick, the founder of Ladino Comunità, who's with us today, did a great interview with him. And in some of Amato's writings, he refers to how the Sephardim initially relied on the Romanian Jews to buy food and also for kosher meat. And he refers to this eggplant situation as being like a point of connection. My Ashkenazi grandmother was Romanian, and this might also explain how that happens. I mean, also, and my other side is of Eastern European origin. So, I mean, I should also say, like, it's a hard talk for me to give. I hope you can understand that. As I mentioned last time, I myself being Ashkephardic, drawing on both of these traditions and thinking about, like, 100 years ago, my existence would be considered perhaps in the race science rhetoric of the time I'm an interracial, the child of an interracial offspring.
Professor Naar, thank you so much for a thoughtful and informative presentation. To what extent have the structures that marginalize Sephardic Jews continued today? Have they been applied to other groups in a more modern context?
Well, I would still say the way they still, not necessarily with the same intense rhetoric that I described, but I would say that the same underlying ideas remain pervasive in American Jewish life and beyond. A synagogue is a shul. The Jewish language is Yiddish or Hebrew. It's, all of this idea of Ashkenazi ways of thinking about Jewish everything, Jewish names, Jewish languages. Did you see there was an article about Seth Rogen's new movie called like The Pickle or something like this, where he speaks in Yiddish got to watch this preview for this thing. And I saw that the big headline is the most Jewish movie ever. And again, the same definitions that applied 100 years ago still apply today. That when people say Jewish, they mean Jewish generally in a specific way, which is an invocation and a reference to Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish culture in all domains. So I would say that persists. It persists in academia. It persists in the denominational movements, Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, which were all created by Ashkenazi Jews, with the exception of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was a conservative seminary, is a conservative seminary. Some of its founders were part of the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community, not the Eastern Levantine Sephardic community. But I would say that these dynamics are alive and with us. This is what justifies having a Sephardic studies program at a place like the University of Washington, because if there's not a Sephardic studies program, if there's not this initiative, this experience will remain invisible, as it generally does in almost all Jewish studies programs across the country. The only element of Sephardic Jewish history, culture, theology, philosophy that is part of the mainstream Jewish educational curriculum at the Jewish school level, at the university level, is the medieval piece, for all the reasons that I described. And for all the reasons why Levantine Jews wanted to claim that legacy, because they wanted to be part of the story. They wanted to have a seat at the table. We have wanted to be part of the story. We have wanted to have a seat at the table. We have wanted to have that desire, that request, Déjame entrar, me hazaré lugar, finally fulfilled. Let me enter. I will make a place for myself. Waiting for that place still to be fulfilled. Waiting for that seat at that table. Next time, I will be talking about those who thought that the table might need to actually be burnt down and reconstructed from the beginning. But that's going to bring us for next week.
All right, we're going to take about maybe 2 or 3 more questions because I know it's getting late on the East Coast. One question here. Even with the attempt to whiten themselves by claiming of Sephardic Spanish ancestry, Southern Europeans were still considered inferior to other Europeans. Can you say more about how no matter what Sephardic Jews did to define themselves, they were confronted with Ashkenazic hegemony, Orientalism, and notions of whiteness, and how this created a huge loss for Sephardic Jews in our histories?
I mean, I would say that is all correct. You're gonna have to tell me who asked these questions at some point too. That was great.
No, I promise. Sorry, I apologize, Evan. We'll make sure we send those all those names.
Yeah. No, that's okay. But it's a really great question, and I think it continues to resonate still today. I mean, I think in the United States, race is very much about skin color, and it is about a variety of different aspects of heritage. But there is also a kind of civilizational kind of hierarchy that continues to exist today. The way in which the culture and the practices, the traditions, the representations of the Levantine Jewish experience. And I'm using this now broadly. We can say the Ladino speaking, the Greek speaking, the Arabic speaking experience, the North African experience are not really part of the mainstream narrative. And I think we have to shake up the foundations of the way that we narrate Jewish history to ourselves. We narrate the Jewish experience. I mean, one of the reasons that I got into this particular area of interest, I mean, there are the family stories, but also when I was in college, the 350th anniversary of the arrival of the first Jews to the Americas happened. This was in 2004. And I remember ordering a book by a very, very prominent scholar of American Jewish history. And I remember opening this book. It's like 600 pages. Like, all right, great. Finally, I'm going to learn something about Ladino and how it relates to the American Jewish experience. I'm going to learn about the Ottoman Empire. I'm going to see, so where did the Jews from Salonika fit into the American Jewish experience? And I'm reading this thing and I'm like, okay, I don't think this is going to, and I remember I flipped through the index. Ottoman Empire, nothing. Salonika, nothing. Ladino, nothing. I found in the introduction one parentheses in 600 pages that says that when I use the term Sephardic Jews, I'm referring only to the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, and the Jews from the Levant, I forgot if I said from the Levant or from the Ottoman Empire, will not be part of the story. I said, how is that? How is that? How is like what? I don't exist. Like literally, he was telling me I might exist, but I literally don't matter. And in the history of American Judaism, this story does not matter. That was the message that this scholar made and gave. And the second edition of that book was just released this year, in which now, in addition to the one parenthesis, he has one paragraph in the new preface that says, yes, Sephardic Jews exist, and now there's some scholarship on it. But the narrative does not change. It doesn't make you rethink. Like, I think American Jewish history, the American Jewish experience needs to be completely rethought. Some people are privately texting me, messaging me. Yes, you got those who got the author correctly. Completely invisible. And I think part of the problem is for the Jewish establishment to try to bring in the Sephardic experience, the Levantine experience, the experience of Jews from the Muslim world, would require challenging or undoing or rethinking the way in which American Jewish has been told in this country, which is about American success, which is about Americans part of the European American story. It's about, the Jews, by which is meant Ashkenazi Jews, are with, Italians and Irish and Poles. Not the story that I want to tell, which is about the Levantine Jews. That story is with the Greeks and the Armenians and the Turks and the Persians. That's a different Jewish story. So that's one thing. It will perhaps undermine or challenge the whiteness of the American Jewish narrative. And secondly, it will compel the establishment, the gatekeepers, to confront the devastating elements of intra-Jewish prejudice, which is bad enough on its own, but it is a symptom of the broader system. A system of the broader structure and the internalizing of these systems and structures and dynamics of oppression and marginalization and visibilization. And to deal with that is a very challenging thing to do.
Two last questions. So first, some of the materials shown show that the Sephardim spent considerable effort objecting to their marginalization. Would they have been better off building educational institutions to perpetuate our traditional Jewish practices in a genuine and durable way? It seems that traditional Ashkenazim have done a better job of that. Quote, the best revenge is success.
So it's a really great question. And I think that there are a couple of ways to think about it. Number one is there's a demographic dynamic. So we have 2.5 million Yiddish-speaking Jews coming to the United States between the 1880s and 1924. We have about 50,000 Ladino-speaking Jews. So tiny, tiny, tiny numbers. So that's one issue. The second issue is if you are told time and time again that your culture is not a culture, that your identity is not an identity, that your civilization is not a civilization, that your practices are illegitimate practices, that your pronunciation of Hebrew is not the correct pronunciation of Hebrew, that the way that you observe the laws are not the way to observe the laws, it becomes difficult to surmount that. And it becomes difficult to surmount that and to legitimize yourselves in the eyes of the dominant culture. So I think that that could have been done. It would have been very, very challenging. You might point to what some of the Syrian Jewish communities have done. The benefit that they had was most of the Syrian Jewish community came later. And I will talk next time about how the dynamics radically change after World War II. The bulk of the Ladino-speaking Jews come to the United States in the first quarter of the 20th century. The Syrian Jews come later, and it is a new American culture at that time and new context that shapes the divergent paths for these different kinds of communities. So yeah, I think, investing in education, and that was done. There were Talmudei Torah, Sephardic like religious schools and other kinds of schools in all the boroughs of New York, in many of the different communities across the country where there were Ladino-speaking communities. But even still, there was a question of numbers and of power. And many of the youngsters would wind up going to the Ashkenazi-dominated communities and institutions in which their culture and their language was either not identified or recognized as Jewish, not valued, or explicitly and perhaps even intentionally denigrated. So the fact that the Sephardic communities have survived for such a long time, 100 years in this country, something like the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, I think is a testament actually to the ways in which some of these institutions have invested in a future. And I think now we have an opportunity, now we recognize, now we say, okay, the wool has been lifted. And now we say, so what do we do? What do we do about it? Can we now do all of the things that we wish had been done 100 years ago? We wish we had the strength. We wish we had the forethought. We wish we had the strength to stand up and say, here we are. We are a legitimate community with a legitimate history, and we have a legitimate future.
Okay, we had a lot of amazing questions. We have a lot of amazing more. I think we're going to call it for this evening, but I want to thank Dr. Naar again so much for this incredible part 2 of this 3-part series, and thank everybody else for staying out so late with us. We've over 45 minutes of questions. It's really wonderful. We were able to get so many participants to really ask some really thought-provoking and interesting discussion questions. Just to let you know, this is once again a part of a 3-part series. A 3rd part is going to be next Monday evening, 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific, and it will be the same Zoom link, same access point, tinyurl.com/Naar Talks, or you can find the links posted on our website, sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy, along with all other programming through the new Sephardic Digital Academy program. And a reminder, special thank you to the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation for their generous sponsorship, as well as to our partners, Congregation Orva Shalom and the Seattle Sephardic Network, for all their support in making this event possible. Just on a note, on a personal note, that I did love what, in a sense, what Dr. Naar just said about now is a very special moment when we have a chance to really say, what does it mean to be Sephardic? And how can we be a part of the Jewish narrative? How can we be a part of the greater American narrative? And I hope that many of you take away something from these talks. I certainly personally am. I'm sure many others are. But to think about how you can get more involved in your Sephardic community, whether it be with the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America on a national level, whether it be with your local Sephardic congregation, whether it be Seattle, Miami, Atlanta, Indianapolis, New York, or beyond, or connecting on a very local level with your families, with your communities, with your children, your grandchildren, or your grandparents. There's so many different ways to get involved, and I encourage you all to find out a way where you can contribute to this kind of national dialogue, and where you can play a role in reviving and reconnecting the next generation of young Sephardic Jews, just like the Sephardic Brotherhood is trying to do right now. Dr. Naar, thank you so much again for this evening.
Thank you. Chara buena.
Al vemos.